For now, let's focus on our acting on our values. And as I said, we're going to do some introductions, but I think I should probably introduce our moderator, who is Anthony Hood, who is Associate Professor and Director of Civic Innovation at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. So take it away, Anthony.
Thank you so much, Hetty, for inviting me to moderate this panel, and thank you to my fellow panelists for being here with us. So we're going to be talking about this new strategic initiative by the Southern Management Association called Acting on Our Values. And so I want to just kind of open it up, and Hetty, if you can just kind of tell us a little bit more about this initiative.
Okay, sure. So let me give you a little bit of background about where this came from. So earlier this summer, when we started seeing protests across the country and things like that, and organizations all over the place were issuing statements about their support. And so we started talking about this among the leadership team at SMA and also with the board members. And should we issue a statement? And I really have to give credit to Janaki Goody, who made the very important and critical observation that, right, words don't really matter if you don't back them up with action. And she said, let's figure out what we can do that will actually create some sort of action behind what SMA does. And of course, related to that, as we talked about it at the board level, what I mean, I think we all knew in the back of our minds, but became very apparent as we said it out loud, is that in some ways, SMA is a diverse organization. We have lots of members from lots of different places with different interests and experiences. And importantly, many of those members have expertise that is very directly relevant to issues of diversity, issues of justice, issues of inclusion. And we have even more members who maybe their expertise isn't directly bear on those things, but in some ways is related to it and is relevant. And we said, rather than making this, yes, we want to have actions, and so we will make SMA leadership accountable for making sure that SMA follows through with the actions, but we want the gist of it to come from our members who have this expertise and have so much that we know that they can contribute. And so our thought originally was to just design a structure around which could be a starting place for us. And so you've seen the three sort of elements of what that structure is. Education, which can happen in a lot of ways, but is going to start this fall with PDIs at the conference. Empowerment. This town hall is an example of that, and we hope today that we hear lots of good ideas and suggestions and possible directions that we'll be able to use to move forward and maybe create some task forces or committees and initiatives that actually put into play some of these things that we're going to talk about. And then ideas where we can actually equalize and hopefully use some of the power, the resources, and platforms like JOM to sort of level the playing field across our membership and across academia. And so that's where it all came from, and we're really just at the starting point right now. But of course, again, the most important thing is we really want this to be a ground-up initiative.
Oh, that is so awesome. So thank you for that grounding. And so with that, you know, I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves. Then with your introduction, kind of tie in the work that you're doing right now and how it fits well with this new initiative, Acting on Our Values. So I'll start with myself. Again, my name is Anthony C. Hood. I'm actually going to my 10th year on faculty at UAB. I primarily teach courses in strategy and entrepreneurship. I also have an administrative role working in the president's office. I'm the director of civic innovation. And so in that role, I support the university's strategic plan, particularly around economic development, inclusion, and community engagement. I'm in a city of Birmingham, 74% African American. UAB is the largest employer in the state. And so we have like a social responsibility to make sure that we are a good citizen to our region and to our state. And with that, we have a huge focus on building our entrepreneurial ecosystem and doing it in a way that is inclusive and equitable to all of the citizens in the Birmingham region. And so I'm just really excited about this initiative because, again, UAB and our faculty, staff, and students are involved in a lot of the initiatives that are going on here locally in our city. I like to say that our business schools are really on the front lines of corporate diversity because we are the ones that are training the folks that are going into entry-level jobs, but through our MBA and executive education programs, we're also training those leaders to take on those senior level positions as well as positioning themselves to be on board of directors, which we know we have a lot of challenges as relates to that in our business world. So I think the work that we do is really important, and I would be remiss not to mention the PhD project, an organization that really helped me understand the importance of going into academia. Before I went into academia, I was an engineer at AT&T, and through the PhD project, I understood how being a faculty member could actually be a career trajectory, a very wonderful career, but particularly how I can make an impact in my community through educating the next generation of leaders. And so a lot of the folks that are my panelists are folks that I met through the PhD project. So with that, I will start with how folks are laid out on my screen, and I will start with Alexis Lex Smith, Washington at Oklahoma State. Lex?
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation, Gary and Lisa and Hetty, and the great introduction, Dr. Hood. So I'm Lex Smith, Washington. I am an associate professor of management here at Oklahoma State University at the Spears School of Business, and I've been here 8 years now. And this is also my first year as the Senior Inclusion Officer here at Spears. And what that role entails is essentially being the diversity, inclusion, and equity leader and driver for our division, our unit, the business school. And as such, I'm tasked with developing a culture and a climate for inclusion, not only for our students, but also for our faculty and our staff, as well as building up educational resources and opportunities to enrich the students, but also to give our faculty and staff the tools that they'll need to be the best that they can be so that our students walk out with the kinds of professionalism and cultural competence that they'll need to embark on the world in front of them. I feel excited to take on this role, actually, even in the heat of 2020, because my research area is diversity and inclusion. I've been studying this the entire time that I've been in the academy, and it has always been a passion of mine and really the driver for putting me in academia. And so I'm thrilled to get a chance to actually do the work at my own institution, and as well as study it. So how this ties to our values or our mission of acting on our values, I love the initiative because the three pillars, educate, empower, and equalize, really maps so perfectly onto what we're building here at Spears. On the education front, obviously, I think our core competence as higher education professionals is making sure people have the tools and the resources and the knowledge to have some of these really difficult conversations. And so I think that a big part of my job is to make sure that we are providing that kind of competence at every level. In addition to that, empowering is huge because we are the land-grant institution in Oklahoma, which means that it is our job to make sure that those who want a college education have access to it, and that we perform a critical role in the state as a driver or an engine of social mobility. We know that access to college is critically important in a variety of ways, but retention is one of the key areas that we're going to be working on at Spears. And so I love the way that building our relationships with peer groups like PhD Project, like Management Faculty of Color, will allow us to sort of empower those operating in a variety of institutions all over the world to actually take some of the lessons and tools from the expertise that we have right here in-house at SMA. And then, of course, Equalize. I mean, that's the work of policymakers. And until we have the data, the research, and critically motivated and committed people, we're not going to be able to actually do the work of equalizing. And so I'm happy to be part of the team.
Awesome. Thank you. Donna Maria. You're still on mute, Donna Maria.
No, I had to be the first one to do that, right?
It's all good.
Thank you. It was really nice to hear what both Anthony and Lex are doing, and I think that so much of the work is similar. So, Donna Maria Blancero, I'm currently the Provost and Professor of Management here at Bentley. I feel absolutely exhilarated and honored to be in the position I'm in, because I really do have the opportunity to help make a difference at a university level, and have been working on that. I was recently at the AACSB meeting. I think it was this week. I can't even remember. And there was something I said that I want to repeat here, because I think it's absolutely critical. I think that all of us at universities, and particularly those of us who are administrators, try to look for what we do that's really special, that's brand recognition, so that we can get the very best students. And I support that. And I have a competitive nature. That said, in the area of justice, racial justice and social justice, we need to share best practices. We need to work together, because this is not just for us, this is for our communities. And so I feel really strongly about the fact that there should be no secrets. We should be able to share best practices. We should be able to share where we fall down, where we have problems, where we think we need help, because without everybody working together, it's not going to make a difference in our country. And unfortunately, as is often in these panels, I am the oldest one here, and have been working at this for so many years, probably 25 years in terms of my research that focuses on Latinos in corporate America. But my practice has been more broadly defined as people of color in organizations, and how they can be successful and what challenges they may have. Here at Bentley, like almost every other business school that I'm familiar with, we've had issues, we've had problems. Students have voiced, alum have voiced, faculty have voiced concerns that they have. I'm one of the people that agrees. I'm provost. One would think, come on, everything is great, right? Not necessarily, and I don't mean that in a bad way to Bentley, but being a Latina provost brings about a whole array of issues around, am I a typical provost? No, I'm sure as hell not, and I'm going to make changes. So I am a firm believer in living our values, being very clear about them, making sure that people understand that, and not, pushing back, and pushing back in a caring way. And what I mean by that is, when I look in particular, I have about 300 full-time faculty, about 250 part-time faculty. They're wonderful. They're a very broad range. There are some people that understand this work, research this work, really know what they're doing. There are other people that have lived experience, that they can speak to their experience, but not necessarily the field. And I'm somebody who's always banging that drum of, this is really a field. And so there are theories and there are frameworks and there are best practices, and let's make sure we use them. And then we have people who are very well-intentioned, right? Very well-intentioned, but don't completely understand. So in that respect, I do think we need to meet people where they are and help them move along. And I think that means that, I'm all for this kind of notion of making sure that we pause, that we reflect, and we help educate. If we jump to conclusions and jump to fix things, we're going to miss stuff. It's like weight loss, right? It didn't take you a week to get here. It didn't take you a year to get here. It's taken this country hundreds of years of poor behavior and poor policies. So while I want things to change, I also want them to change appropriately, which means that it takes work, it takes looking at data, and it takes reflection of people, and it takes those who are not, well, in particular, just talking about Black Lives Matter, which I think is really at the tip of our tongues for all of this, for those that don't identify as Black, to hear those difficult stories and don't turn away, to hear those stories and make sure that people know that they're being heard. So I do have a lot to say on this. Sorry if I went too long. Thank you.
No, you're good. Thank you. Lisa, you still there? If not, no word. Okay, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not technically part of the panel, though. I'm just
Okay.
I'm just the program chair. So
All right.
I'm gonna step back and listen.
Okay, no worries.
Thank you.
Thanks. My brother Oscar Holmes the fourth, and I have to give him a roll tide. Y'all know how me and Oscar do. Roll tide, Oscar.
Roll Tide. So thank you so much, Anthony. It's great to be here. I do want to pause and recognize the moment of Black Lives Matter and recognize the pain that many of us feel right now at this moment, particularly after, I can't even say charges that were brought, right, about Breonna Taylor's killing. This is painful for many of us. Like, it's not just a headline. It's really painful. It's really traumatic. But we're asked to get up every day and go to work as if, everything's fine. And it's not fine, and it hasn't been fine for years. So I am appreciative of SMA for having this town hall. I am a child of SMA. I grew up in SMA. And I am only here because of organizations like the PhD Project and all of the mentors I have through that organization, because it was really possible for me not to be here today. And I mean, some people out there know my story, but it was not a guarantee. I did not have a smooth time throughout the first PhD program I was in. So I give credit to the PhD Project. I give credit to the University of Alabama for taking a chance on me so that I can be here at this moment. Like Lex, I do research in diversity, equity, inclusion. I've always done this type of research, even prior to my PhD program and my master's program. I also did this type of research. And these values of educate, empower, and equalize, I live it every day in just who I am, but also my research. In addition to the scholarly side, I am a consultant. So I go out to different organizations and different universities and help them put these evidence-based best practices to work. Just like Donna mentioned, Rutgers, we do a great job in terms of diversity. We're constantly ranked high of the diversity of our student body, but we have a long ways to go as well. And I tell my, tell my colleagues that, yeah, we have diversity, but we also need to get the inclusion and the belonging aspect. And the ways that I've done that to contribute to these values, as an assistant professor, I founded a program called Rutgers University Student Executives. That it was a 9-week program where we brought high school students, underrepresented high school students from 10th to 12th grade on the campus to teach them about business for 9 weeks and to have them learn different business topics. And at the end of the program, they pitched their unique business idea, and they actually got to earn money for cash prizes for their ideas. So it was a way to let them see someone who looked like them in the business school, but also let them know that this is a valuable career opportunity for them, that they may not have had that opportunity. I founded and started a talk show, a diversity dialogues talk show on campus called Beyond the Mill. Like, no one asked to do this. Like, where did this come from? But I was like, well, we really need to have these hard conversations on campus, even in New Jersey at Rutgers. We see ourselves as very liberal. We're in the North. We're not like those people in the South, right? That's what they say. But no, we have some conversations we need to have here in New Jersey as well. I just look at social media and the things that our governor posts, Phil Murphy, and some of the residents, their comments. You would think you were in Alabama, some of the things they say, in response to Governor Murphy's support of Black Lives Matter, right? So the on-campus diversity dialogue show is in its second season. We completed 2 seasons. That has spun off to a podcast called Diversity Matters. And again, I want to get our research out to the general public so that it's just not us as scholars learning all this information, but we need to package it in a way that's digestible to everyone else. And I realized that I didn't even tell you what I do. So let me circle back.
Oh, I was going to circle back to that. And I want to say this before you do that, because each one of you are in leadership positions in academia, and that is so important to see diverse faces and people who do the work of D&I in these positions of academic leadership. So make sure you speak to that as well, Oscar.
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor of management, but effective July 1st of this year, I just became the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Programs as well. So Donna and I were just speaking before the call started about how important it is for people of like mind, people who, have the desire to actually be in these roles, because the decisions that we make in this role have a long-term impact on not only the students, but faculty members, staff members, the community. I can't get into details, but there are several things just in the short 2 months I've been in this job where decisions have come across my desk, and it could have easily gone another way if I worked in that seat. And there's a lot of institutional barriers that we need to break down. And if we're not in these roles, then it's going to be really difficult to break down these barriers. Just to give you a quick example of a huge institutional barrier that we have that is just tradition is SATs, right? GREs or GMATs. Because of COVID-19 this year, we have gone test optional, right, for students, similar to many other campuses around the country. But clearly the policy may come back, right? So as the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Programs, I lead curriculum initiatives. I work with the undergraduate curriculum committee as well, but, I could have some impact on what that committee does. So that's something that our dean is already talking about, because I shared with her my desire to really look at this, the pros and cons of both sides, to see if it can be something that we can actually do forever and not just a temporary thing with COVID-19, but it's something that we really need to consider. And I know it's a huge impact because there's rankings and all these other things we care about that go into all of these test scores, but we need to have people in place who are willing to have these tough conversations with people and really look at the institutional barriers that we put in place, because when we talk about institutionalized racism, universities and colleges like to think we're not talking about them. Like, we are part of institutionalized racism, right? So I think, I want to encourage everyone, if you have the desire, right, to really, truly consider the administrative track as well. And I think you can find it really fulfilling as well. I found it fulfilling. And it just, to me, it's just an extension of the scholarship that I do and putting those things in practice. So again, I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Donna Maria or Lex, you guys want to chime in on just the importance of you guys to be in these positions of leadership in academia?
I'm going to defer to Dr. Blanzero.
Doctor all of a sudden here. I wholeheartedly agree. I think we all know from being undergrads to doctoral students that we understand how the literature talks about it starts with leadership, and sometimes that can be a cliche. And in the case of D&I don't believe it is a cliche. I believe that when others see us in these positions and recognize that it can happen and it should happen, they know that they can move forward. I know that when I was an undergrad, I had my first Black professor, and he remained my mentor until he passed just a few years ago. I felt like he looked like a member of my family, and if he could do it, I could do it. But even more so than the individual impact, I think Oscar is absolutely right. This is the opportunity to make change, to effect change that allows obstacles to be broken down, barriers to be broken down, because so many people are talking about, let's have implicit bias training, let's have this training, let's have that training. That's fine. It's absolutely fine. You need a strategy, and you need to break down systemic racism. And when you're in a position, when you're an administrator, you can make that happen. And I would say, for me in particular, I feel that my university and our faculty are absolutely behind this, but I also think that many people don't know how. They like, tell me, what can I do? And so it's really important to be able to lead.
Absolutely. When I think about SMA and what it's meant to me, it's easy for me to be involved in SMA because I'm right here in the South, and so it's always easy to get to the locations. And I know people come from all over the country to come to the SMA meetings. When I think about somebody like a Gary Adams, where ever since I came into academia, Gary always got, the students of color and the faculty of color together on the Friday of SMA, always make sure that we went to lunch. faculty members always pay for the broke students and pay for their food. And, but, that camaraderie was just always so important to me. And I think about my dissertation chair and my current mentor, Mickey Catchmore, who's a former president of SMA, and what she's meant to my career and taking me around and introducing me to people at SMA. Like, that's just been pivotal to me as a student, as a junior faculty, and now that I'm going into this other role. So SMA, I think, has always had these informal ways of making sure that we're driving diversity and inclusion. But I want you guys to talk about, like, why is it important for SMA now to take this active, more formal role to address systemic racism in the academy? And I just want you guys to kind of speak to that. Why is it important for SMA to do this now at this time, formally and actively?
So I'll quickly start. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Lex.
So I was only gonna say, I think that like every professional, we look to our professional organizations to set the tone and also to set what our ethical standards will be. Those are our standards for excellence in behavior, right? We learn from our professional organizations what it is to be a profession, what it is to be a citizen in this profession. And I think that when our governing bodies indicate to us this is how we walk, it shows the students, it shows the faculty, and it shows everybody coming up, this is how we do things. And I think modeling the priority is critical. And then, of course, what we do once we've got everybody's attention is the next big thing, right? What are our actions going to be?
So just co-sign everything Lex just said. And to just briefly add on, the fact of the matter is the way society is right now did not happen by chance, right? It's not just by chance that we have these different social hierarchies in our society. It was deliberate. And organizations and institutions need to be honest about their role in either instituting practices that were discriminatory, but they can't stop there to say now we're not going to do this anymore. The JAP did 100-year history of the research in the journal. And it was just fascinating to see the topics that were published and just what was called diversity, equity, inclusion at the time, and just how discriminatory that those studies were that editors allowed to get through, right? So we just have to admit, SMA, AOM, all of these organizations, that we've contributed as well, like I said, to this institutionalized oppression. And we can't just say, okay, we're not going to do it anymore. We have to do something to correct it. One of my favorite quotes by Malcolm X is, you can't stab me in the back 12 inches and pull it out 6 inches and still we making progress, right? It's not that you just can stop inequality at one position in time and just think people have a fair chance, right? You have to be proactive and institute things so that you can redress the past harm that was done. And that's why it's also important for SMA to take a leading role for all of the reasons that Lex brought up as well.
Great, thanks.
Oscar, that analogy is a powerful one. That's a really powerful one, and thank you for mentioning that. I do think that, as I said earlier, that we need to all be in this together. And so organizations need to push this and need to help people get together who have a common background and be able to move forward on this. I firmly believe in that. I also think that it's absolutely imperative for organizations to admit that there have been past behaviors that were wrong and not just rush to look at all the good we do and we're going to do this now, we're going to do that. Maybe this is a poor analogy, but I always look at it as we've probably all been in the situation where you're out shopping and something is wrong, like somebody's treated you poorly, the product hasn't been good. And I've been in the situation where it's been like, fine, we're going to give you a refund. Thank you. And I've been like, no. I need to let you know what my experience was because it really harmed me. I want you to hear it. Sometimes the $20 item, I don't really care about it. I want you to know how your customer service employee treated me. And that's a very minor example. So my point is that for all the systemic racism that has gone on for all these years, organizations need to stand up, admit the wrongdoing, and listen. People want to be heard, and that begins the healing. And I think that is just so important. And I don't say this in any sort of a stereotyping or generality, so please forgive me if anyone's offended, but there are so many white people who just are so afraid to engage in the conversation around race that they run away from it and try to help. Try to help by all means, but they run away from the really tough conversation of listening to it and understanding the sort of harm that they were part of, right? And many people are part of. We're all part of the system. If you look at issues around, frameworks around racial identity, we all know that we're part of that, right? We're part of that as well. But until we agree to discuss this openly and admit the wrongs that have happened, we can't move on.
So that makes me think about, I hear people talk about reverse discrimination and how when we have these initiatives that seek to redress some of the past discrimination and oppression and injustices, it feels like, people who are in the majority are being oppressed and feel like, things are being taken away from them. Like, what does the literature have to say about this, and how does this play out in practice?
I'd like to comment.
Please.
I have serious issues with the term reverse discrimination. Serious issues with it for a few reasons. I love everything that Oscar and Donna Maria just said, because it really captures the idea that there are past injustices that have gone on that need to be addressed, and also acknowledged so that we can do the healing work that is required to move forward. But I also want to emphasize that these aren't just past injustices. It continues to reverberate and create new echoes and versions of those same injustices. So I'm teaching a new course this semester, and I got to the chapter about legislation around equal employment opportunity, and particularly around the pay gap. And there was a whole section, several pages long, on reverse discrimination. And I was like, this is currently in our textbooks right now. I'm so angry. I'm still angry that I assigned that chapter. And I probably spent too long in class talking about it. But this is the issue, is that the past concerns are actually right now concerns, right? And the idea that conversations like this are exclusive or exclusionary, I think, is a defense mechanism. And it's a way to quiet a conversation. It is a way to say, well, that's not my conversation, and flee. Or it's a way to say, why aren't you including me? But you don't actually want to be included. Or it's a way to say, because you're having this without me, you must not need my help, therefore you're on your own. And that also is a problem. So this conversation is happening in small circles in the beginning, because there has to be some difficult conversations that not everybody is ready for. And then we grow from there. And so to me, it seems like a big part of what we have to do in creating the space for these conversations is also to give people the language and some guardrails around how to manage these conversations. Because as Donna Maria just pointed out, many white people, and many people even beyond white people, but especially white people, are not really given language around race, and actually given a lot of language that says, don't talk about race ever, right? So we have to start building up the vocabulary, the language, the space, and really the freedom to have those discussions and really act on them. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I have a lot of strong feelings about reverse discrimination.
I mean, these are the conversations that we have to have, right? And I think, in light of the murder of George Floyd, I think it's an invitation, but it compels us to have the conversation that perhaps we weren't having before.
So I feel exactly the same way Lex feels. It incensed me really when I get that question, because One is like, you need to go to Diversity 101, Google some stuff and learn some stuff on your own, right? If you're asking a question like that, because typically people only ask questions like that because they want to shut down the conversation and maintain the status quo. All right. But not to be a person just want to give quotes, but a resource, the book by Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. You know, he has a famous quote in the book that says, the only remedy for discrimination is anti-racism discrimination, right? So again, you have to be proactive in addressing these issues and instituting practices and policies to make up for the past discrimination that occurred. But at the end of the day, let's hit it on the nail. This is not just stuff that our parents and grandparents experienced. Like, we experienced this today in 2020, right? Like, we all are privileged and have great lives, but we deal with some legit racist issues as professors, right, in the academy. So this is not something that's just in our history. It's something that we live in the present with institutions. So, you know, take it up from an administrative standpoint, one of the things that I see is occurring in institutions is trying to shift to the language of first generation students. You know, people don't necessarily want to focus on DEI efforts anymore. We just call it let's focus on first generation, because as a result, that also catches a lot of our underrepresented students. And while that is true, I always have to bring up the point, and many of us on this panel can attest, typically it's always just one of us having to bring up these points or call in attention to these issues, is that we can't replace first generation language and think that is going to solve issues of racism in higher ed. Because here's the thing, first generation for white students is not the same thing, or doesn't mean the same thing as first generation for Latinx, Native American, African American students. And every day I leave my home and every day I come back to my home, I'm reminded of this all of the time. If I look at my neighborhood, and many people know it's really expensive to live in Northeast, New Jersey has extremely high property taxes, but if I just look at my neighborhood and look at the people in my neighborhood, and my township just happens to be 90% white, but the people who are able to live in my neighborhood, how many of them don't have college degrees, but they're still in the same neighborhood that I live in? Like, that's first generation for Black and brown people. It's not the same, because there's plenty of white people who are first generation who are still wealthy or who have never went to college and their kids are still well off, right? That's an issue that I see universities just trying to sweep under the rug. But we're here in this moment telling, no, we're not going to let you do this. You're going to continue to talk about this, and you're going to have to address these issues of racism for our Native American, Hispanic American, and African American students.
Go ahead, Donna Maria.
Thank you. I feel compelled to just comment on that. First of all, you both, I couldn't say any better than the both of you did, so I won't add to that. But I will stand here and say that we have a first gen program, you know, and I want to make it clear that I was part of that. And I do think that, well, I don't think, I will be clear. I know that sometimes having programs that are termed first gen with the goal of all students of color is the quickest path to getting certain programs done. And so if there's one thing I have learned over the past few years is how to work the system. And you know, sometimes that means that I'm doing something that I wish could be a little different, but I think to myself, at least I'm making headway. And not to advertise this program, but just to give you an idea. So the program that we had, you know, so every student is in fact a student of color. And that was my goal. But I cannot state that sort of legally on my webpage, but that can be the outreach that I make. And so I think, you know, I think back, my husband has an old yellowed a letter to the editor that I wrote many years ago that he sometimes threatens me with, where I essentially said that at times our communities can do nothing but violence because that's the only way we're going to be heard. And I sometimes still feel that way. But I have also grown to realize, after being an administrator for a number of years and being provost, that if you really want something to happen, sometimes you have to sort of figure out how to do it. And then once it's in place, to sort of modify it. So while I agree with you on that, Oscar, I think that sometimes to get to the outcome that we want, we have to, and you know, I may disagree with this in a year, but I just wanted to, I didn't want to back away from the fact that I agreed with you, but I saw that I did it myself.
No, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that those programs aren't valuable. What I am saying that institutions can't just use those programs to address all of the issues. Right? And I think, so the way you explained the program, you clearly are a person who understands that race and ethnicity is central, right, to these challenges. And so it was only about institutions just trying to skirt around the issues of race and ethnicity by applying this broad umbrella because they really don't want to deal. And that's not something that you're doing in Bentley. So
yeah, I mean, the short of it, without going into too many details, is there's a strategy with many components, and this is one. But thank you for that input.
You know, when we think about D&I from a global perspective, you know, it seems like the discrimination, the injustice, and the inequities that we see in America, a lot of times it feels like it's unique, particularly when we look at our history of slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration and everything else that we see, you know, in America. But the academy, broadly writ, is becoming more and more international. And a lot of times our colleagues outside of America, when we talk about issues of diversity and inclusion, particularly from a racial standpoint, it doesn't feel the same to them. And so sometimes it seems like they struggle with the things that we deal with here in the States. How have you seen that? And what do you think we should be doing differently in the academy to think about D&I from a global international context?
Well, I think from the academy's perspective, we need to be receptive, and when I say we, in terms of PDWs, PDIs, but also journal space, to be willing to publish, right, those issues coming from different countries. And I don't necessarily think reviewers and editors, when we get those type of papers, none of us on this panel, but other people may say, oh, well, we, you know, such and such did a paper on race already, but it's from a U.S. perspective, so what are you adding? And I think we get that a lot in the field, where if you have a few papers on race or gender or anything like that, we get comments back and say, no, these people already published this, so we don't need another paper on this issue. But not to pick on OCBs, but there's thousands of OCB papers out there, like extra moderator. Oh, here's a mediator. It's like, okay, if we have 3 papers on race, people think like we know everything about this. It's done. And
We've gotten to the end of the internet as it relates to D&I.
And I say this because I'm a scholar who get these types of reviews back, right? And just shout out to JLM, who published an editorial some years back that they actually looked at the data to see if it really is more difficult for scholars to publish diversity research in JLM, and they found that you know, the second R&R round, it was a higher hurdle for those articles to get accepted to JLM. So shout out to JLM for doing, you know, that self-reflection and making the data public. But, you know, this is something that I lost my train of thought. Sorry. I totally lost my train of thought there.
It happens at a certain age, Oscar.
I know. It's very hairs.
I really would love to add to that, because it's really an area that drives me absolutely crazy. Early on in my career, I had a sample of about 2,000 Latinos, and I was basically told, nobody wants to publish this because it's only brown people. And I remember in my youth getting on the phone with the editor and saying, I noticed that you tend to write about only white people. Like, what's the difference here? And so what really drives me crazy is, even when there's a discussion around how much more research there is being published on diversity, and I have nothing against publishing research on diversity that includes all kinds of people, But when you want to publish something with a sample that's only Black or only Latino or only Asian, on and on and on, there's still difficulty with that, as if that's not important enough. And I find that to be really irritating, if you can't tell. And so we need more, to your point. I was going to use job satisfaction as mine versus the OCBs. Like, you can have a bazillion papers with just this tiny little incremental difference, but you can only have one paper that looks at, Blacks in leadership or Latinos in with OCBs even. And so that really does have to change.
Oh, if I may, 'cause I just got my train of thought back.
Oh, go for it.
So I will say, white supremacy is a universal phenomenon. That's how I will answer that as well. If we just know a little bit of history, there were a lot of European countries colonizing the entire world. So to suggest that this is just a U.S. phenomenon is just dishonest and not doing justice to the literature that we already know. And in fact, even within countries, we know there are things like caste systems that are prevalent in different countries, right? So in our entire existence, there are hierarchies, social hierarchies. So it may not be the same flavor as in the U.S., but these are universal themes that citizens in countries all around the world are dealing with to this day. So that's how I would respond to someone in that question, if they ask that question.
I love that, because I think that it's something that I keep thinking about, our current cultural context, our U.S. context relative to the rest of the world. And I have to tell you, this summer and probably the last several years where we have evidence of the miscarriages of justice and just abuses against people of color, and especially Black men and women, is the first time we really have that kind of straight up photographic evidence. And so I even in my own experience, even though, you live your life, you hear these stories all the time, it is now for the first time, I feel a deeper connection with the world, with refugee crises in Myanmar or in other parts of the Middle East, where we're experiencing the same sort of oppression, group-based oppression. So in some ways, I feel more connected to other communities that face this sort of systemic oppression than I've ever felt. And in that way, I would like to see more research and dialogue on, as Oscar just pointed out, the universality of patriarchy and, white supremacy, but really supremacy. When we think about religious genocide going on in pockets around the world, I see more connections now than I've ever seen before. And I think in some ways, this is an opportunity for us to look at the ways in which there are systems of oppression and really look at intersectionality in a real way that I'm not sure I would have, at least me, and others probably have thought these things too. I'm not sure that we've been really acting on that, on those thoughts, on those connections. And I think this is an opportunity, and I'd love to see more scholarship on that. I'd love to see more conversation around that. And you're right, Anthony, the Academy is a perfect place to have those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I was about to ask, if anybody wants to go even deeper. And Hetty, I don't know if you want to jump into the conversation, but I'm just thinking about what's the research that we're not doing that we need to do, given the realities now. And then this is almost a tangent, but I think it's something very worth us talking about. I have two daughters, two African-American daughters, and I'm thinking about what is life going to be like for them 10 to 15, 20 years from now. And we're 50 plus years removed from major civil rights legislation, but we're still talking about, is the Voting Rights Act, our ability to vote, is that up for grabs, or who somebody can marry, or reproductive rights and, rights for women. And it's just amazing that in 2020, we're still having conversations around rights and privileges and liberties being restricted or being removed altogether. So what's the role that we have as academics to make sure that we're weighing in on some of these conversations? Because again, some of them feel like taboo if we're in a corporate environment, but we as academics, and that's one of the reasons why we have tenure, is that we can speak about and do research on these topics that may get people in trouble if they're in a corporate environment.
I totally agree, Anthony, and I think we need to talk to other people besides just academics. I said it before, and I think someone who's a great role model for this is Dr. Herman McGinnis. One, I love just how prolific he is, but two, I just love how he tries to get his research out there to the general public. And recently I saw a social media post where he highlighted where Justice Ginsburg used, right, in her opinion, some of the findings from his research. So I think that these are the ways that we can do this. It's our responsibility. I feel like it's our responsibility as academics to use our scholarship, use our teacher, use our voice, right, to make people listen to us. And because we do have some security to make people listen to us, and we can't be quiet in this moment. So I think Herman is just a great role model for someone who bridges scholarship, rigorous scholarship and practice all the time.
I certainly agree, and I can't say enough around the need for impact in the way that we're talking about it. We need impact in that we need for business organizations to understand some of the issues that we're talking about. And I also just want to comment that I know that we have, quite a bit of a chat going on here. And I would really like to just speak to the idea that we need to remain open and to allow people to have, to be able to speak what they think, as long as, clearly, as long as it's not hateful speech. I don't think that we're the police around what people want to say or don't want to say. And I'm going to give you a very specific example that was on Instagram for my own university, where a faculty member said, "All lives matter." And a student was really, really affected by that, right? A Black student felt really affected by that. And we had a conversation that really spoke around making sure that your classroom is one where students can in fact learn and not feel marginalized, and that why would somebody bring up a topic that literally ended up not being part of the content in any way, shape, or form. And so I certainly believe that everybody has the right to believe what they think, as long as, again, and we're talking about thought and belief. We don't police thoughts. We don't police beliefs. I would hope that many people who maybe disagree with some of the notions that we're talking about would in fact appropriately remain open-minded around some of these issues and sort of begin to understand it. But I want to just reach out and say that, again, being very specific here, obviously very light-skinned, present as white, I'm Latina, as I mentioned, but I'm really talking about Black Lives Matter here. And I'm saying that that's the topic here today. I'm not talking about women's rights. I'm not talking about LGBT rights. I'm not talking about any of those other rights. So by focusing on one area does not take away from another area. But right now, that's where everybody's hair is on fire, and we need to deal with it. And so I think we just need to recognize that. It's not suggesting that other things are not important as well. But right now, there's no other pandemic worse than COVID as it is for Black lives Black people being murdered. And so I just think we need to really think about that and understand that notion.
Can I just jump in and add too? So in many ways, just echoing what Donna just said, this initiative stemmed from what we saw going on in the world, not starting with George Floyd, but they got the attention this summer with George Floyd. But we have always intended this as an inclusive initiative. There are many people who are marginalized in many different ways, and it's not okay for anybody to be marginalized in any way. And we are very open to as I said at the beginning, I certainly don't see myself as the smartest person in the room, and I think that all of SMA leadership recognizes that it's our members who have the ideas, that have the experiences, that have the expertise, and we are very open to the ideas that way we can promote this initiative in a positive way that's going to benefit all different kinds of people. We want to hear from you, and we want to get you involved.
Great, thanks. Go
Can I
ahead,
just add, so just adding to what Hetty and Donna said, we know from the research that if you focus on truly dealing with systemic racism, particularly anti-Black racism, a byproduct of that is improving the lives of everyone in the group. And to give a perfect example, for decades, Native Americans have been trying to cease their imagery, their names as mascots. The greatest offender was the Washington football team. But because of the work of the Black Lives Matter movement, finally, that team in Washington, right, changed its racist name because of all of the work that civil rights activists are doing in the Black Lives Matter movement. So when we focus, if we can fix and break down systemic racism, patriarchy, heterosexism, misogyny, like all of these systems of oppression will be better because Black people intersect in all of these other identities as well. All right, there's disabled Black people, right? There's LGBTQ Black people. So focus on the issue here, and we will improve all the other systems of oppression for other groups of people as well. So this is not either or, it's always a both and movement.
That's good, thank you. For those that are watching, we want to encourage you. I know there's a robust conversation going on in the chat. If you can notice, I might not have called you by name, but I am reading, and so I've been trying to weave in some of the aspects of what you're asking into the conversation. And I see an actual question from Scott Geiger, and I'm going to paraphrase, but essentially, what kind of tips do we have for embedding some of this into strategic management classes? And I'll just give a little bit more context on that. I think sometimes when we think about D&I, it seems like it tends to be relegated to the OB focus classes, the management classes, leadership. But when we think about stuff like strategy, entrepreneurship, the economics courses, how do we make sure that we're embedding DE&I across all of the different disciplines in our business schools? And Lex, I'm sure that's something that's probably top of mind for you in your new role, trying to integrate DE&I across everything that we do in the business school. So what does that look like for you guys? Have you had an opportunity to kind of embed these and things outside of just your traditional management, micro OB types of courses?
Yeah, I mean, that is fundamentally one of the critical ways that we can begin to start injecting the value of DEI in all of what we do in terms of education. And so if we begin with classroom education, think about all of the ways in which all the tools that you bring in, right? You use a textbook, and I'm sure you have tests or cases or what have you. Think about all of the ways in which our lives are not in black and white. Our lives are in color, right? And so there are cases about protagonists from all different backgrounds. You can look and find cases at Harvard or Northwestern or Case. Pick your bag. But there are cases with diverse protagonists all over, and the protagonists or the protagonist actors don't have to be themselves from underrepresented groups. The subject matter could be around centering diversity or centering a different strategy. Like just today on social media, someone was talking about Michelle Roberts, the NBA lead attorney for the Players Association, and the work that she did, not only in terms of collective bargaining for NBA players, but then also the messaging, the Black Lives Matter, all of the stuff on the back of their jerseys, the whole approach to the bubble. That's a case in the making, right? Like, I mean, we have to look for opportunities to bring real life into our classroom. And if we're just a little bit creative, man, we can do a lot. So think about your cases. Think about what articles you're using and what authors you're citing. If you use Harvard Business Review or other kind of translational pieces, what research are you translating? Is it more audiences or more research about OCBs or job satisfaction? Or are you looking at some other variables, right? Are you looking at issues of equity? Are you looking at the impact of some of the policy decisions that we push with diversity and inclusion? So think about your materials and think about going outside of the box you've always been in and look around in some new boxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Donna Maria.
Lex, I wish I had you here at Bentley. I wish I had all of you here. I agree wholeheartedly. One of the things that we're talking about here is exactly that notion that you're right, Anthony. There are some disciplines that lend themselves very easily to this. But if we look, and I can look across my university at every single discipline, and you could pick up a textbook, you could think about the examples that are given, and this is an example of people not meaning to be racist, but this is an example of how this occurs. You pick up a textbook, they're almost always, the leaders tend to be men, they're almost always white, partners, especially if it's a small business, tend to be heterosexual couples. There's just certain normative things that we see all the time. And so I just hired a new instructional designer who specializes in inclusive pedagogy. Every single faculty member at Bentley needs to go through training on inclusive pedagogy. It's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take some time. For now, I just have lots of resources. We had a meeting yesterday where one of our pretty incredible accounting professors, probably one of the most prolific in the country, really talked about how he leads, not a white man, he talks about how he leads his class with examples around issues of color or issues of race. He talks about the examples he uses. And, there were so many faculty in this room who were like, oh, I didn't think about that, to Lex's point. So I could go and look specifically for a case that just normalizes people who are not straight white males. And again, I'm married to a straight white male. I'm a fan, right? I'm a fan of my husband's. But we need to make sure that we see all kinds of successful and unsuccessful people. And I think that's where we want to sort of shine the light, that there are many different kinds of people that just are, and that are successful. And that's what we're missing in universities today.
How do we, let's talk just a real quick, no, this can't be quick. Let's talk about microaggressions. When people say, Oscar, I don't see you as a black person. I don't see your color. Donna Maria, I don't see you as a woman provost. I just see you as a provost. Why do we have to talk about race? Why do we have to talk about gender? Why do we have to talk about sexual orientation? Isn't that just dividing us? When people talk about, why do we need a management faculty of color association? Why do we need special interest groups for women or people of different sexual orientations or people of different abilities? Why do we need those things? Because it seems like those things tend to just divide us instead of bringing us together. How do y'all respond to that? And how do you bring those conversations up in the classroom to help our students not go out into their jobs and continue that kind of line of thinking?
I'll start. So as I mentioned, I teach in Oklahoma State, and it is not known to be a panacea of visible diversity. So having discussions about why we're having, for example, a class on diversity and inclusion, which we do have here. I teach it, and I find it important to have this conversation in a way that my students understand. And so you'll forgive me if I kind of walk you down an example. I actually got this advice from the late, great Dr. Kathy Phillips, and it was really around how I can connect with my students in a way that centers the experience of not being in the center of the room, not being the normative one, not being the standard. And she suggested that I start with class because, many of our students here are first gen, many of our students here are not coming from privileged backgrounds in terms of socioeconomic status. And so it was a way for us to begin to have a conversation about advantage and disadvantage in a way that they could get their hands around and really identify with and empathize with. And it really made all of the other conversations much more manageable. And my lesson from that wasn't necessarily how to sequence my syllabus. It was that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, because of years and years and years of misguided training, we have been taught that race is something for the brown people and the Black people to deal with. When in reality, we have to all dig a little bit, to borrow, Dr. Opie, Dr. Tina Opie and Dr. Beth Livingston's analogy. We all have to dig a little bit into who we are and really find what it is that, like an element of our own identity that we can understand, that can begin to give us some empathy about what it is to be left out, why it is somebody might want to center something that has been painful, right? Because race is seen as this painful, difficult, divisive conversation. So why would I want somebody to tell me that they see that I'm a Black woman? Well, I want you to tell me that you see I'm a Black woman because it's important to me. It doesn't have to be important to you. It's important to me. And my identity is not for you to give me permission to acknowledge or for you to decide is important or not. It's important to me, and so you should let me lead on that, in the same way that if it wasn't important to you, that's your decision, right? And so when we talk about creating spaces, it's because we don't all walk through this life in the same shoes, and we're not all experiencing it the same. And so when I think about meeting people where they are, I am asking people to think about, where is an identity group that you have trouble with or others have trouble with about you? And try to live in that uncomfortable space for a minute and experience that and decide, if that was your everyday reality, would you want to be surrounded by some people who maybe share that with you and maybe can help you carry that load, maybe can help you figure out solutions for navigating a world in which that isn't really welcome? It's about empathy.
If I can add to that, that was really well said. I come from an institution where it's about 25 years of having diversity retreats for faculty and staff and teaching diversity. And so I have really added to that, but I really appreciate the people who came before me. And one of the examples that they used that I found incredibly valuable in my consulting, in my teaching, whether it's executives or first-year students, is as follows. Instead of starting with a topic that is so charged like race or gender or sexual orientation or religion, we start with talking about what is it like to be right-handed and what is it like to be left-handed. And we start with, so what's it like to be left-handed? And you get dozens of examples, from sports to getting ink on your hands to scissors to all kinds of yard equipment, saws, et cetera, lots and lots and lots. And then you always have people in class sort of appropriately whining about how horrible it is to be left-handed. And you kind of sit with that for a bit, right? And then you ask the class, okay, so what's it like to be right-handed? And you get silence. And then you finally get the little, well, it's normal. It just is. And then you begin to, and again, in not a charged manner, be able to speak to, so when you walk through this world as somebody who's right-handed, you have no idea what it's like to be left-handed. You don't have to deal with any of, and usually it's a blackboard full of them. You don't have to deal with any of these issues. I have found that to actually be really valuable to start a diversity class with, because again, it's something that regardless of one's racial background, they can relate to. And I have found that it sometimes just turns on the light bulb for some people to sort of really recognize that, I guess I never realized what it's like to be left-handed. And then, of course, then you build, as the course goes on, to identities that are much more salient to us. But I have found that to be really valuable, and I really appreciated those people here at Bentley who taught this 25 or 30 years ago and then taught me about this.
We got a question from Vicky Gallagher. She says she's teaching a change management class for master's level diversity degree, looking at interventions at the individual, group, or institutional levels. How do you balance them programmatically?
Could you elaborate a little bit more about what she meant by balancing them programmatically from institutional individual level, Vicky?
Yeah, Vicky, if you can just type and give a little bit more context, and we can circle back to that one.
I mean, to try to answer it at a high level, I will say that I will focus mainly on institutional level because it's a lot of work to put on the victims, right? The responsibility to repair the system that is broken. So we do have individualized strategies that we call compensatory strategies that people can use to mitigate racism. So, things like using affiliation tactics, things like trying to use racial humor. Those are ways that you can kind of mitigate bias, but I will look again at the institutional level of policies, like what can we change? To give it a quick example of the example I like to use of how to explain equity versus equality. At Rutgers, when it comes to parking, we use an equity ideology. Equality would be everyone pays the same thing for parking, right? But equity says make it fair. So our parking pass is a percentage of our salaries. So, if you make a lot of money, your parking is a lot higher. And I believe in that policy because, why should the custodians and the cafeteria workers pay the same type of parking than I do? I make six figures, right? So if you think about your organization, what can you do that you're currently doing and make it equitable? That's the path that I think you should take. And it could be something as simple as parking. It can go a long ways. But there are so many examples of things you can put in place to make it more equitable and not just have it the same thing for people across the board. And parking is just one quick example of how we've done something at Rutgers.
Gotcha. Samantha Erskine had put a comment in there. She's an Afro-Latina PhD student. And I'm going to paraphrase, but essentially, are our journals and is the field ready for us to really start doing research on using language like anti-racism, white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility? Because of the context right now, does that make it more or does it make it easier or even more difficult to get postdocs, initial positions? Is there more funding for it? It seems like every other day you look up and there's some corporation that's putting money up to do diversity-related initiatives and research. So, how do you see the field changing? Is it going to be easier to do this work going forward?
Boy, I see my two buddies here, Oscar and Lex, thinking no, and I'm thinking yes. I feel like we are at a point, we are at an inflection point where I think that it can happen. I think that if we continue to push, and I think if we have lots of white allies who understand the issue, I mean, I'm seeing a difference in right now in this year, and I think it's also a combination of everybody being irritated as hell because of the damn pandemic. And they're sort of like, I'm not taking this anymore, and being a lot more vocal about it. And in some way, I think it can be easier for people to have this conversation on Zoom. Like you're not feeling that, that energy. And so I'm hopeful.
I'll offer two quick perspectives. I think, it depends. I think there are certain people and they have institutional backing that'll make it easier for them. But I think some other people may still face the same challenges. For example, they may not have the name brand of the institution behind them that they're able to do this work. So I think it depends on where you're situated in this field of how easy or how difficult it can be. But to give another example of the corporate space, as I mentioned before, I consult with a lot of organizations. And before the pandemic, regular clients, things were well. But when the pandemic happened, things dried up, right? For many of my colleagues around the field, no more calls, events got canceled, rightfully so, right? You think, okay, pandemic companies are going through many challenges, blah, blah, blah. But it's so interesting that when protests broke out, right, because of George Floyd, this is just weeks later, right? We started getting inundated again with the calls. And so my question for this, it was just enlightening for me to go through this myself as a consultant, right? Of having stuff dry up. People saying, we don't have money for this, blah, blah, blah. But then just weeks later, getting all these calls. And it told me that corporations, organizations were using the pandemic to jettison a lot of their DEI work. They truly were not behind many of it, because just weeks later when the protests happened, they found money all of a sudden. Now, I'm not saying there's organizations that aren't hurting out there, but there are many organizations who were really well off, who were not hurting, who were just using the pandemic as an excuse to get rid of DEI issues. And I think many of us who consult in this space can attest that we had clients that just dried up, and they just weeks later, and we're still living in the pandemic, by the way, boom, all these organizations find money, right, to have these types of conversations. So that was just a really important insight that I learned just going through this experience of looking at how organizations responded to DEI in this moment.
It's interesting. So we're about 10 minutes away from probably wrapping it up. Lex, I want you to get your comment in, and then I want to kind of end by you guys maybe offering some of your various best resources that you think people need to check out, because the work of DE&I is everybody's work. This is not something that you can outsource. Everybody has to do the hard, deep work of educating themselves, and then everybody that they have influence with around them. So I want to make sure that you guys do that, as well as put, Oscar, I know you do a lot of consulting, you got your podcast and stuff like that. So please put your information in the comment box so people can find more resources from you. Go ahead, Lex.
Yeah, actually, that's a perfect question, because it kind of captures what I was going to say anyway. Don Maria captured my expression perfectly right. I definitely am worried and also optimistic. I think that this time has made it so a lot of people are accessing information, podcasts and videos that they wouldn't have before. And it's not just everyday people or those who were already interested, but it's others, right? It is our reviewers. It's reviewer two. Reviewer two is listening to Oscar's podcast and maybe learning some things. And maybe reviewer two might be more open to that 2,000 strong Latinx sample, or, the 150 Black dyads, or whatever it is. So to me, I am hopeful because I see this proliferation of creativity and insights, and suddenly also all the translational pieces are just flowing like water. And so I'm finding it easier to teach this material to people outside of the DEI space, as well as to find the words to communicate my own thoughts. And so I think there's a lot of hope because of all of the activity. But I think that, like many things, without systemic and systematic changes, that energy might just hit a wall. And by systematic changes, I mean our journals need to make more space for this. It can't be that we can have 75 leadership papers and only 3 papers on race. It can't be that we've said everything there is to say about women of color, or whatever. It can't be that. Not if we've been talking about LMX forever. We can do more. We can do more on all of these topics. And as we explore intersectionality, as we explore areas of and pockets of diversity, and also policy making, culture change, crisis management, the intersections are incredible. So I think there's a ton of space. And to your specific question about what to read or what to be listening to, I've been finding it really, really cool to get into the podcast world. I love Oscar's podcast. I have been a huge fan of, Beyond the Middle for Forever anyway. So it was easy. And actually that made it easy for me to meander into a variety of other podcasts as well. I spent a lot of time on NPR. And so I love Code Switch. That's a really good place, especially if you're just starting to learn some things, to find some neat resources. And then I'd say for those who are interested in learning a little bit more about how to have some of these conversations about systemic issues of racism, I would really strongly recommend the Kendi book. I mean, there are very few people who just break it down, unpack it, turn it inside out, and then hold it bare up to the light for you to see. It was a well-written book.
Right. And
Anyway.
I've been searching for a lot of his podcasts, and we're just watching him on YouTube, and it's just awesome to hear him actually just kind of speak about it. So Ibram Kennedy, How to Be an Anti-Racist is it's a book that we say, if somebody's in the chat, if you could just kind of put a hyperlink to those materials, I would really appreciate it.
So I included some links to give people resources. And thank you so much for the podcast, Love. I really appreciate it. It's a labor of love. But I will also suggest Dr. Kennedy's first book. So if you haven't read his first book, Stamped from the Beginning, that book is a phenomenal book that takes you through the history of slavery up until present day. So I love How to Be an Anti-Racist as well. But if you really want to get a great understanding, his book, Stamped from the Beginning, it's awesome. Also, so I'll stop right there. I was going to do a quick plug for AOM, but I'll stop.
I want to address very quickly, Anthony, the question that you asked around maybe providing something that people can do. At Bentley, we established a racial justice task force that I co-chair. We have over 100 people in it, and of all types, meaning students, alum, et cetera, et cetera. People are working together, coming up with toolkits, with help for people. And then the one thing that we did is we started a racial justice healing challenge. And we have groups of 5 to 6 people. We have over 100 people who are working on that. I've brought together some of my academic leadership. This morning I met with 2 of my associate provosts and 2 of my deans around this issue. And the first topic that we talked about was racial identity. And that was really eye-opening for those individuals who had just never thought about this. And so I think that engaging in those kinds of conversations with your colleagues can really make a difference.
Great. So again, I want to encourage you guys to put your contact information in the chat so people can follow with you if they need to. And so I'm going to pitch it back over to Hetty and Gary. But one of the things I seemed like I kept seeing in the chat section is that what about the people who are not convinced that we need to have these conversations? Sometimes it feels like when we have these panels, we have these workshops, we have these symposiums, PDIs and things like that, we're just preaching to the choir. It's all the people who know that we need to have these conversations, but the people who are not convinced don't show up for this, and they are not part of the conversation. And I think this is why this Acting on Our Values initiative from SMA is so important. SMA being a regional division of the Academy of Management, taking a leadership role as it relates to this, to make sure that all of us are a part of this conversation. Not everybody's going to come from it from the same perspective, but if we can have a conversation and we can do it in a respectful way and seek to try to understand everyone, and just like Lex said, to me, it's all about empathy. How can we empathize from somebody else's perspective? Because at the end of the day, that's why we're here as academics. We're here to understand and also to help others to understand as well. So with that, I want to thank my panelists for sharing their insights and comments. I really appreciate it. I always feel like I learned something from you guys, so thank you for teaching me. So with that, Hetty, I'll turn it back over to you.
And I'm going to turn it straight over to Gary, because I think is the one who put this whole thing together, brought these wonderful panelists to us. He should be the one that closes out the session.
I just want to say, first, I'm not really at the beach. I'm sitting in my office. So y'all don't worry, I didn't take
Don't believe it.
Run away or anything. Just wanted to say thank you first to the audience for participating. You guys asked some really awesome questions. And that's what I said. I think the point Anthony made is really super important. And that is, this initiative is designed to foster dialogue and conversation. And no one is coming in with closed minds. And all we ask is people listen to what's going on, take the dialogue into consideration. You may change your mind, you may not, but listening is the first step in the process. So this is just designed to, the first step in introducing the initiative and to really foster dialogue and conversation. Thank you so much to my moderator, Dr. Anthony C. Hood, and my panelists. I love you all. I owe you guys. So I know next time if we ever see each other in person again, I'll definitely, you remind me and I'll take care of y'all, but I appreciate you so much. And I think we had a really interesting and informative conversation and dialogue today. I also would like to thank the Management Faculty of Color Association. They helped us coordinate, sponsor this event, and we're going to be doing some program initiatives with them going forward. So we appreciate their advice and interaction and support of this. So that's it. We are good to go. We are recording this, and it will go up on the SMA webpage. So you will have access to this. So you can view it if you have any more questions, ask others to view it. I know some people requested that we put the chat up as well so people have access to some of the hyperlinks and things in there. So we'll make sure that that gets taken care of as well. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of the week and a good fall semester. Everybody stay healthy and happy. And I know I'll see everyone at SMA 2020. So we're going virtual, but it's going to be a good conference. So thank you all.
Awesome. And shouts out to Paul Johnson, our CTO, for providing the technical support. Appreciate you, Paul.
Thank you, Anthony, because Paul is the man. And that went over my head, so I appreciate that.
Well, you don't have much up there, so are we still on? I'm sorry, I said that out loud. My bad.
Are you marginalizing people without hair?
Wrong.
So
Thank you all for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Time out. So appreciate it.
Thank y'all. Bye-bye.